This is a production of WTVI PBS Charlotte.
The state issues performance grades for public schools. The governor talks about a Carolina comeback. Senator Tom Tillis' hand-washing comment generates a buzz, and we remember a local legend. Those topics and more on this Off the Record. Good evening, I'm Jeff Rivenbark. Thanks for joining us this week. My guests are Tom Bullock with WFAE, Glenn Burkins with Q City Metro, Erik Spanberg with the Charlotte Business Journal, and B. Thompson with WBAV. So very glad you're here. The North Carolina Department of Public Instruction released performance grades for public schools this week. The letter grades for schools are supposed to help parents judge how well their child's school is performing. Now, one of the things that we were noticing Thursday when the letter grades came out is that 1/3 of CMS schools received a D or F. So I think my question for you is this going to make it easier for parents to know if their school is doing its job? But there's also some people who say, wait a minute, it's not factoring in some of the other things we need to be looking at.
Well, it feels like a mess already. I think it was at 60% were C or lower, I think, in CMS. And one of the conversations that's already started is it's weighted much more to the test scores than the improvement in test scores. And so obviously, if you have a school with children who are having difficulty and they're making gains, that's not factoring in as much. So that's just one of many issues. By the way, we're on a 15-point scale here, so these are generous grades, believe it or not.
And next year, they're actually going to a 10-point scale.
Yeah.
Wow. And I think under that scale, I believe the numbers would show that 50% of CMS schools would get a D or an F. But the thing that strikes me here is listening to the response from CMS and from principals. I wish when I was a student that I would be getting the same kind of spin that they put on it, which is basically this is just one test, it's just one metric, what's really important is that you show improvement. It is a mess, you're right, Erik, and it's just one of these things where also, what's the consequences? I mean, the only thing that I can see that they actually would ask these schools to do or the school district to do is send a letter home to parents basically saying, well, this is the grade that we got. But there's no ramification, no justification, no explanation of what that means, what it entails, or even necessarily steps that say, okay, well, but this is how we're going to improve.
But we do have a new fight, right, B? We have a new fight.
We have a new fight. And the thing that strikes me, though, in what you were saying, Erik, and what you were saying, Tom, is this. If I were a parent, I'd be very confused at this point, because even if you send a letter home, if educators are having issues trying to figure out what this is about, and parents are going, what? I just want to know what my child did. It will make it harder for parents to decipher this. And also, if you looked at that and said, my child's school got a D, you're not going there next year. So now you've added another layer of what do you do in meeting educational concerns when parents say, I don't want my child at that school. So it's almost like we're back where we started and saying, are schools equal in the type of education that they're putting out? And this shows, no, they're not.
Well, and the other thing, go ahead.
But the sad part is that, in my opinion, at least, those who are making the we're making progress argument, they're trying to hold the schools to a standard that we don't hold our students to in terms of testing and giving them grades. Basically, students are given grades based on how well they perform, not on their overall trajectory. And even if they were to increase that percentage that goes into the improvement factor, it doesn't change anything that a certain percentage of the students are not performing proficiently, and that's the real bottom line.
Well, the other thing is, and most of us should know this, but perhaps we don't, is when you break it out in terms of socioeconomic status. I mean, it's just awful. It's just painful. It's shameful. Every horrible adjective you can come up with, and so that's the real test here. Is then does this spur any more action to lift these schools and lift these students who are dealing with tough circumstances?
I don't know that it will help them in trying to do the recruitment of educators and people for schools. Everything that they've tried to do, we still see too high a percentage of beginning teachers in schools that have some issues, when what you want to do is put the more seasoned teachers there. Let me do a comparison here a little bit. It's like officers who have been on the force for a long time. They're going, I earned the right to go and be in a district where nobody's doing any crime. And you put the rookies in the area where you really need a seasoned
Overnight,
person.
Myers Park, I got that.
Yeah.
And to your point, I was just speaking with a young lady yesterday whose husband is a teacher here in CMS, and she said the students at that particular school, there are just so many disciplinary problems. He can't even teach them the language he's there to teach them. And I'm like, so what's he going to do? She said he's looking for another job. He's ready to leave there and go somewhere else with his degree.
Right, because when your pay's already lousy, now your morale is worse because you know you're teaching in a school that's an F, and then you're also having to be a nutritionist, a social worker, a counselor, all these things. And oh, by the way, with the other spare 2 minutes you have, can you teach them?
Oh,
to
and
answer
you're
your-
going to get graded on it as well. They're going to
Right.
determine whether or not you get to stay as an educator based on all the factors you have no control over.
But to answer your question, will it address those low test scores? Probably not. Unfortunately, what we're more likely to see is an effort to mask that by changing the formula for issuing grades.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. I think it's an important one, and I want to go off of what you said as well, B. If depending on how parents react to this, if in fact you start seeing them moving their students because they don't like the D grade or the F grade or even a C grade, well, those schools could see a decrease in funding because they have fewer students, which causes the problem to accelerate. So what's going to happen? What I'm curious to see is whether or not the state actually holds to that 10-point scale in future evaluations, or if suddenly, because of the backlash, they pull back.
Right. It's going to go to 25-point scale.
Which they did with all the. I mean, how many times have we seen
Grading
that
on the curve.
when the scores
done it.
come to students? So now, why wouldn't they do that with schools? And it just starts turning into more energy being spent on setting up a system where the schools don't necessarily look as bad, instead of addressing those core
Issue
issues.
of making the
Everybody
school
gets a
better.
trophy.
Yeah. Well, another big topic this week, North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory laying out some of his priorities in his State of the State speech Wednesday night, some of which include passing a historic preservation tax credit, approving a $1.2 billion bond to jumpstart transportation projects, renovating aging buildings through a general bond, and a proposal to raise teacher base pay to $35,000. Now, the governor was emphasizing a Carolina comeback, and while Charlotte and a lot of big cities across the state are seeing a comeback, a lot of the rural communities are not seeing it quite as much. They're still struggling.
Well, first things first, he just wrapped up. So the speech has just ended. So we're just in time. Yeah, I think
Oh, wait, no, he's back.
Oh, he's back. Okay.
Yes, he's back.
He's still talking about the fountain. The man is not going to put up with a filthy fountain. So I think that's one thing we learned. To me, this really felt like the first speech of the 2016 campaign.
exactly
And
right.
I think it sets up with his whole argument is, as you said, he's going to say Carolina comeback over and over, and he's going to talk about the falling unemployment rate, and he's going to talk about what the decline in tax rates have done. And you already saw Democrats come out and say, hey, wait a minute, you never mentioned the middle class. People are still struggling. And as you said, Jeff, as bad as it may be in some cities, in the rural areas, it's that much worse.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right about the 2016 campaign. I mean, we could talk about individual policy priorities, and the man did speak for 80 minutes, so we have a lot
to talk about.
of policy out there. But what was lacking to me were specific details. You brought up the transportation bond, which is going to get a cool reception, I'm guessing.
Already has.
Yeah, in the state Senate. That was really one of the few areas where Governor McCrory talked about specifically how he was going to pay for a proposal. Teacher pay, $35,000. No mention about what would happen for more experienced teachers. No mention of how he was going to pay for that. Tax incentives, expanding the amount of money that they can use to lure companies to North Carolina.
Also a chilly reception.
Also a chilly reception. Also no specific funding measures. That
Medicaid.
It felt, it felt like a state. I was going to say,
Another.
Well,
this
that
really felt
is-
like a
that
State
was
of the
really
Union
interesting.
because it was
Yeah.
really long, and a lot of the things that were on the list are unlikely to pass.
Buzzwords, catchphrases will not answer the questions the public has. When you have your own party questioning some of the things that you're putting out there and saying that's not going to fly either, there needs to be some substance behind what we're hearing. And if we as journalists are sitting there going, what's the public doing?
I think Governor McCrory realizes that a lot of people who voted for him are probably disappointed in the first part of his term. And you're absolutely right. The first speech of the next campaign, he knows he has to moved back to that moderate ground where everyone thought he was to begin with. And you can't gerrymander an entire state. He has a concern that his Republican colleagues don't. Many of them live in gerrymandered districts where they don't really have to worry about re-election. They can stick to their guns. He doesn't have that
they are
luxury.
in very red districts. He is in a purple state, and that is the big concern.
And you saw him shift from more of a right to more of a center. I'm not sure I would go so far to say moderate, but he certainly is trying to come back as the mayor of Charlotte. That helped him
And you
get
can
elected
see
in the
him
first
trying
place.
to thread, though, B. You can see him trying to thread the needle with not alienating and offending Phil Berger and his other friends in the legislature. Even things such as Medicaid, which he clearly wants to expand, but he's searching and grappling for the right language. It's going to be a North Carolina situation, not a Washington one, and still nothing's happened.
Well, let me use a catchphrase. Politics makes strange bedfellows, and right now they're in the same bedclothes and they don't want to sleep together. That would be your Republican governor and your Republican legislature.
And let's not forget that he lost a major ally when Tom Tillis went off to Washington.
Because Tom Tillis washed his hands of rubber.
No, he hasn't. He needs to just wash his hands.
Before we get to sanitary practices, let's, what's interesting to me is, we talk about Medicaid expansion. It's important to note that there are two words that the governor never said together in that entire 80-minute speech: Medicaid and expansion. He danced around that on a political tightrope because he knows the reception he's going to get. I spoke with, two senators. I spoke with Senator Tart and Bob Rucho, and both of them were like, And what's interesting, though, is he's throwing it out there. It's a trial balloon, but without Tillis helping to guide the House along with the governor, what you have now
is skeet shooting.
Well, I'm going to call it a three-ring circus because, even though that they're all three bodies are controlled by Republicans, they are nowhere near singing the same song and even in the same hymn book.
Well, the thing I find interesting is we talk about how these politics are dancing and the politicians are dancing with each other. You, the public, should pay attention to this. How many people in North Carolina would benefit from an expanded Medicaid? Those who say they don't have the money to cover themselves. And there are Republicans who say, well, let's give them a tax break so they can pay for it. Well, if you didn't have the money in the first place, a tax break doesn't really help you. So while they keep doing the dance, there are people in this state who are trying to figure out, how can I get that? Am I eligible for it? You're eligible for it, but the politicians say you're not going to get it.
Here's part of the challenge, though, because I will say one of the things that Governor McCrory has done really well is he hit on this Carolina comeback thing, I don't know, a year, maybe more. I mean, if you see Governor McCrory and he doesn't say Carolina comeback, you probably haven't seen Governor McCrory. But, so he has that and he hammers it home. And after a while, people just start to, that's why politicians repeat themselves, because you start to say, oh, okay, we must have had a comeback. But on the Democratic side, other than saying, no, these guys are extreme, we don't like what they're doing, what is the message, for Roy Cooper or whoever it is, what is the Democratic message? Because we don't know it now, other than we don't like what we see on the other side.
Well, now is the time to start formulating something instead of waiting for somebody else to do it, and then you go, see, they misstepped again. Give me something solid that you're going to do.
Because people like positive messages.
Yeah, I don't want my
Carolina
vote to be based upon a negative of what somebody else didn't do. I want it to be based upon what are you going to do.
And the Carolina comeback, in all fairness, is part of a much larger national comeback. We're not We're not coming back alone.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, and moving on to that other topic, Senator Tom Tillis' hand-washing comments generating quite a buzz this week. While talking to the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C., Tillis was trying to make a point about the need to reduce the regulatory burden on the country. And he said, I don't have any problem with Starbucks if they choose to opt out of this policy, as long as they post a sign that says, we don't require our employees to wash their hands after leaving the restroom. Do you think it was a bad example?
That's the
example.
understatement, because
Custer,
for
Little
one
Bighorn,
thing,
bad day.
what have we seen in the last few years when we're talking about public health and how diseases and everything else is spread? Even though I know he was trying to make a point, and he may have been trying facetiously, but don't play with people's food, and boy, wash your hands. What's the matter with you? That doesn't make sense. Use some other example, because we've had too many cases of things happening with public health.
Well, let's look at the
and
week,
he's
though.
trying to talk about
It's
regulations.
flu season.
You
It's
don't
flu
tell people
season.
don't wash it. I wish I would see somebody coming out of the bathroom and you're anywhere close to where my food is. Me, my money, my pocketbook are headed for the door.
Let's look
and
at the
even if you look beyond the hygiene thing, it doesn't reduce regulation.
No,
You're
it doesn't.
simply
Right.
exchanging
Right.
one regulation
sign.
requiring them to wash their hands for another one requiring them to post a sign saying,
It says we
I'm-
don't.
I'm waiting for
Signs.
yeah, exactly. I'm waiting for someone to be like, "Oh, this proves Tom Tillis is in the pocket of the sign industry," because
But
that's all
I think
it does.
what it does say is someone in his camp said, "You're the new senator. You got to start saying something. You got to put something out there. You better fire that PR person who told you to talk about not washing hands because you got some spin, but not the spin that
Right.
you wanted."
Let me fulfill the dream of a conservative watching one of these programs, the liberal mainstream media. I just want to get this straight. So there's no climate change.
Yep.
We're not going to wash our hands. And by the way, no measles vaccinations. That's kind of the week we've had on the
Yeah.
GOP side. I mean, that's a tough week for the Republicans. And even, the Wall Street Journal hammered Rand Paul. So these kinds of things are not helpful. And I do hope the senator was kidding. He probably was.
I don't think he was kidding necessarily, but I think he missed an opportunity. As a small business owner myself, there probably are some areas where we could work on government regulation.
Absolutely.
But I think by giving such an extreme and ridiculous example, he just took the debate in a place where it probably
And it
shouldn't have
lost its point.
Yeah, none of us
Exactly.
heard anything after
No.
you don't have to wash
After
your
you don't
hands.
have to wash your
In
hands.
fairness, you're exactly right. I mean, in fairness, this is a consistent track that Tillis has had, whether he was at the State House or in Washington, D.C., which is, industry regulation can be overdone, and we should look where we can clean out efficiencies. I just hope clean is what he focuses on next.
Find a better way to say it and wash your
Who wants to have a
hands.
constituent coffee with him now?
I'm sure he'd like to have that one back.
Yeah.
Yes, he would.
Well, cops and barbers, that was the focus of a meeting last weekend with the aim of building stronger relationships between residents and Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police. CMPD Chief of Police Rodney Monroe saying both he and members of the North Carolina Barbers Association organized the meeting to head off misunderstandings between the public and police in the wake of a string of police killings of unarmed black men. Do you think what Chief Monroe is doing is on target and what needs to be done?
Well, I mean, Glenn, you were there. What did you
I'm
see?
going to go ahead and say it. Chief Monroe gets it. He understands that there is a problem, especially the disconnect with the police departments, and I say plural, not necessarily just Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, and some of the people in the African-American community, namely young African-American males and people in disadvantaged neighborhoods. He understands that, and I think he deserves major credit for reaching out to these communities to try to bridge that divide. That's not something you see in every city. In a lot of cities, you see police departments stiffening their backs. You see the policemen's unions or whatever, almost becoming rigid on these issues. Chief Monroe understands that if CMPD is to be effective, he has to have the cooperation of the people in the community, and that's what he's trying to do.
And I liked one of the things you pointed out in your article, Glenn, this week, the challenge or the call to people at that workshop to, sign up and be a police officer, be a CMS police officer. We need more people of diversity that are taking on those jobs. So we
Right.
can,
Well, and you've also seen an interesting thing. Tom, I think you were at the meeting when he went through the ordinance, the whole policy, and one of the things they talked about was there was no way of cataloging racial profiling. I mean, that was stunning to me. I don't know if a lot of people knew that.
Well,
So
it's something
he
we've
is
talked
trying to
about
take
on
some
this show
steps.
before, that if you don't have the numbers, then how do you know what you're
Right.
doing? The best thing about this is him being proactive, getting ahead of this. Because as you move into this year, what happened in Ferguson, what happened in New York, those are still resounding with various communities. When they had the latest meeting in Ferguson, Missouri, there was a representative of the police union who got into a pushing match with a woman who was there from the community asking questions. So no police department wants to be branded by something that's happened in another department, but it does mean that each department has got to be proactive. You've got to ask people to be a part of the solution instead of saying that's their camp and they're all against us and this is us and we better.
And Glenn's
just pull it
story
together.
pointed out the lingering effect of what's happening in other
They
cities.
spend as much time, they being police officials, they spend as much time answering for Erik Eric Gardner and Ferguson as they did for anything that happened here. Not naturally, they can answer for those, but you're absolutely right. What happens in other police departments in other cities, unfortunately, taints what happens everywhere.
And Chief Monroe made it very clear about the dismantling racism program that they already have implemented with CMPD to try to get officers to confront their biases and figure out,
Yeah, and he's doing something with that I think is really important, because bias can sometimes be hidden to the person who has it. And he's trying to use big data and basically be able to track more than just, lessons or adding diversity to the force, which are two very important aspects. At that same meeting, they were talking about using analytics to go through and try to identify biases before they become systemic. That basically look at every aspect of policing in order to make sure that if there's a hidden bias or an actual bias, it is confronted, it is identified, and it is worked on. And that's actually really tough to do, because you're basically telling the police force, we're watching you. And some people may have a problem with that. They may start questioning the motive.
Well, I think you have to use the same type of test, psychological and personality tests. And I'm not sure how much of that is done in policing when somebody says, I want to be a police officer, I'm a good citizen, and I want to do that. What percentage of psychological tests are you giving? So you know on the front end, not on the back end, that someone may have a predisposition to say, I don't like this, but this, I want to get in here and this is going to be my career, so I got to put up with this until I move to the next level. And I think that's where you've got to catch it. And it's not just in one race, it can be in all races. It can be somebody who felt like, yeah, y'all were always discriminating against everybody, and now I'm the police officer. So I would like to see it, and I think it would go a long way to explain to the public, we do find out before they get in as much as we possibly can. You cannot say that you're assured nobody's going to change or act crazy once they get in there. But if you can stop it at the beginning, then you don't have to account for it on the end.
I think there are two other things here that are obvious but should be mentioned. First is that you have an African American man who is the chief of police. That helps in having the conversation to some extent. I mean, it's still horribly difficult, but that does help. The other thing is he has taken steps, as we have this case coming up with the Erik trial. He's taken quick action where he thought that people did not handle police work in the right way. So I think that gives him some credibility as he goes out and has these workshops.
And the other thing that this does, and because sooner or later something bad will happen again here in Charlotte. It's inevitable in policing. This will give this police department incredible goodwill, and that goes a long way towards diffusing things when that inevitable bad thing does happen.
And I think the key, too, again, back to the barbers, that's an excellent way to really connect with the public. So props to him for doing that. Charlie Sifford was the first black player admitted to the Professional Golfers Association. On Tuesday, he died at the age of 92. And you may remember just a few months ago, we mentioned Charlie Sifford because he was up to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He really paved the way for a lot of other golfers. This week, Tiger Woods said, without Sifford, I probably wouldn't be here. He paved the way for a lot of us. And he was a caddy here in Charlotte. He faced a lot of racism in the early days.
And I think it wasn't just Mr. Sifford. If you know any of the players with the Par Busters Club on West Boulevard, a lot of those guys were around and they all played together. And there were a lot of black men out of Gaston County who played. I remember a good friend of mine, his grandfather was a caddy over in Gaston County, and he would always tell me about his grandfather couldn't play until after it got dark, and then he could go out and hone his skills. Well, that grandson went on to become the head of the Golfers Club at North Carolina Central because of his grandfather. And his grandfather knew Mr. Sifford as well. If you go to the corner of Remont Road and Barringer Drive, it used to be Revolution Park. It's now named after Mr. Sifford for everything that he did. The irony of it being he couldn't play there before, and he would have to wait until after dark to try to do this. But he never lost his ability to try to help others. He never let it make him bitter towards. And I think in so many instances for African Americans, when you're the first one doing something, we have all been told as children, you represent all of us. So act like you got some sense. Do your best. Stand up. Be proud. And that's what Mr. Sifford did for everybody.
Well, and he had to go to Pennsylvania to play a lot. But the other thing I was going to mention is, for a long time, we ignored the history of having Romare Bearden as a native son. And let's hope that Charlie Sifford has his name put on something significant
With
soon.
the park there and First Tee Golf Course is over there, and they have that name for him, which used to be the Revolution Golf Course. But with Romare Bearden also, because his grandparents were here in Third Ward, and it was so hard for him. So as a young child, they basically did what a lot of black people did. They shipped him off to New York, and he stay up there.
And in addition to Mr. Sifford, we also saw an African American pioneer in NASCAR.
And Wendell Scott.
Wendell Scott inducted
Really nice
Into the
ceremony,
NASCAR
too.
Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
That's right.
A lot of those early pioneers are now passing on.
And it's a good reminder. I'm sorry, Jeff. It's a good reminder that, for me, I didn't know who Mr. Sifford was until actually I saw the obit. And it's to have it happen at the same time as Wendell Scott's induction. Everybody knows Jackie Robinson. Everybody knows Jackie Robinson. But on a broad scale, there were always people who were stepping up, and they didn't necessarily have the support that a Jackie Robinson had. I regret the fact that I never had a chance to meet Mr. Sifford. He sounds fascinating.
And one of the things that I remembered reading the articles this week was about, Charlie Sifford would have to go and eat his meal in a locker room while the other golfers were in the dining room. And that just kind of resonated in my mind. I'm like, you know what? How could that happen,
Just like black entertainers, when you're coming to the South and the rest of the band eats in the restaurant and you have to eat in the back, or they hand your plate out the back door. Remember, the song Strange Fruit was written about black men hanging from trees in the South as this woman came. But remember this, too. Everybody's got to plow the field before you get a harvest. Mr. Sifford was man that plowed the field.
Well, that's all the time we have this week for Off the Record. Thanks to my guest, Tom Bullock with WFAE, Glenn Burkins with Q City Metro, Erik Spanberg with the Charlotte Business Journal, and B. Thompson with WBAV. Coming up Tuesday night here on WTVI PBS Charlotte, Charlotte Douglas International Airport could have one of the highest jet fuel taxes in the country unless next year lawmakers take action. What's at stake and how it could impact your wallet. That's Tuesday at 8 on Carolina Impact. Be sure to friend us on Facebook at WTVI PBS Charlotte for a chance to win monthly prizes. I'm Jeff Rivenbark. From all of us, thanks so much for watching. We hope you have a great week.
A production of WTVI PBS Charlotte.